We are thrilled to welcome Professor Jonathan Kaufman, Director of Northeastern University's School of Journalism, who is joining us this evening to help us explore one of today's pressing education challenges. How can we understand the interplay of media and education in our society? And how can teachers respond to teach current events at a time when they and their students are struggling to decipher what is true and false in our media-driven world? Our very own Susan Zeiger will introduce Professor Kaufman, but I have the privilege to introduce Susan to all of you. Susan Zeiger is a historian and a program director at Primary Source, which we are grateful for every day. Over the last decade, she has created school curricula and face-to-face and online courses of lasting impact. They have included teacher professional development programs with special attention to content on Africa, Latin America and the Caribbean, and global approaches to the teaching of U.S. history. Her published curriculum projects include The Volunteers, Lesson Plans for AFS International and the National World War I Museum, and the Teacher's Guide for a New Exhibit in Boston, Long Road to Justice, African Americans in the Massachusetts Courts. Susan has authored and co-authored successful grant awards from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mass Foundation for the Humanities, the Cummings Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Education. For nearly 2 decades, Susan was a professor of history at Regis College in Massachusetts, where among other responsibilities, she helped prepare pre-service teachers for elementary and social studies, elementary and secondary school teachers for social studies. Susan is the author of books and articles on topics that include immigration and race, international relations, gender, war, and peace movements. Entangling Alliances, Foreign War Brides and American Soldiers in the 20th Century was published by New York University Press in 2010. She has written guest blogs for Education Week and Teaching Tolerance, most recently for Women's History Month, a piece entitled Insist on Persistent Women, Women's History in the K-8 Classroom. I am pleased to welcome Susan and Professor Kaufman on the stage, and I'll come back after their conversation to wrap up this program. So thank you all.
Jonathan Kaufman, I'm so pleased to welcome you to Primary Source and to the stage this evening for this informal armchair conversation that we had a great time planning. You will all find Jonathan's full bio in the program booklet that you received tonight, and I'm just going to share a couple of highlights by way of introduction as we get started. Jonathan Kaufman is a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, editor, and author, and currently, as Jen mentioned, he is professor and director of Northeastern University's School of Journalism. He was previously at Bloomberg News, the Wall Street Journal, and the Boston Globe, where he held leading senior positions at all of those papers. And Jonathan's team at Bloomberg, for example, won numerous awards, including the 2015 Pulitzer Prize and the Education Writer Association's Grand Prize. At the Wall Street Journal, Jonathan was, among other roles, the China bureau chief based in Beijing. He is the author as well of 2 compelling and still highly relevant books, I have to say also of great literary merit. One, A Hole in the Heart of the World, being Jewish in Eastern Europe, and Broken Alliance, the turbulent times between blacks and Jews in America. And Jonathan, in his spare time now, is working on yet another book, which is very exciting, based in kind of an adventure story based in Shanghai, which you must come up and ask him more about, and you can read about in your program. I'd also like to mention what is not in your program, which is that Jonathan is married to noted journalist Barbara Howard, and Barbara Howard is probably known to many in this room because she is the local anchor for All Things Considered on WGBH. So you have certainly heard her voice if you have not had a chance to meet her. And she'll be coming off air and joining us a little bit later. Jonathan and Barbara are the parents of 3 remarkable young adults, one of whom has joined us this evening. And I think, is it correct to say that they all speak some Mandarin Chinese?
Yes.
To varying degrees, yes. So that's interesting to this audience too. So Jonathan, I'm going to ask you some questions. We'll start this sort of interview style, and the ground rules are that I was supposed to mention are that you noticed on your chair that you have these cards. I'll ask the first couple of questions, and then we would love to have your questions for Jonathan as well. So throughout the time that we're speaking to each other, about 20 minutes in, some of my colleagues will be coming down the aisle and collecting your cards. If you have questions, we probably won't get to everyone's questions, but we'll look those over and answer as many as we can, and we'll collect those at a few points during the conversation. So with that, let's jump in. So I wanted to start with a big picture question for you. As you scan the landscape of news reporting in 2018, we wanted to know what's keeping you awake at night. If you had to rank order the biggest threats to the news media at present, what might your list look like?
Okay, thank you. I did want to start by thanking you for the invitation to speak here. Primary Source is a great organization. I also checked with the White House, and they've promised that President Trump will not tweet or fire anybody or withdraw from an international agreement for the next couple of hours, so we can put away our cell phones and enjoy ourselves. What keeps me up at night? I think like a lot of people, often my cell phone keeps me up at night, and I think that's actually kind of a window into this broader question, which is that, I teach now, and so with the movie The Post that came out, I don't know how many of you saw that movie The Post, about the Pentagon Papers, I wanted my students, who are older than maybe Primary Source's audience, but not by much, to understand the history of the Pentagon Papers. So I went back and looked up that famous Spiro Agnew speech that you might remember or have read about back in the 1960s, when Spiro Agnew denounced the nattering nabobs of negativism and sort of attacked the press, because Nixon was as hostile to the press as Trump is now. So I went back to find the speech, and I actually discovered that the beginning of that speech is very interesting. It starts out with Spiro Agnew saying, every night at 6 o'clock, a group of 12 men get together in New York and determine what the American public will read in the news the next day, in the New York Times or on the networks. And I read that and I thought, those were the good old days. And I think part of what's going on now, and part of what does keep me up at night, is the torrent of news that we can all get from our cell phones. And that has created a situation where great opportunities, because you can now read about the Middle East in Middle Eastern publications, you can read about China and Chinese publications, bloggers, and so forth. But also, as we know, there's very polarized news out there. There's a lot of fake news out there. So the old gatekeeper model of journalism, which people railed against for a long time, I think liberals and conservatives. When I was working at the Boston Globe or at the Wall Street Journal, people on every side of the spectrum, people no matter what their cause was, would always say, we can't get our message out. Why won't you print this? Why won't you tell us the truth of what's happening? Well, now we can all curate our own news feeds. We can get whatever news we want. And all the surveys now show that the polarization that we see politically is also true in terms of the information that we get from our news. And before, I think liberals sometimes say, oh, look at Fox News and they're so bad, and Breitbart. But in fact, surveys show that while it is true that conservatives are more likely to get their news from Fox and certain conservative sites, liberals are more likely to defriend people on Facebook who they disagree with. So polarization kind of goes both ways, and I think we're all part of it. So one thing that keeps me up is the kind of the loss of a common conversation. How do you have a common set of facts, a common set of values to talk about? And I think one of the things that Trump has shown himself to be very good at is exacerbating that. Typically, presidents have tried to find common ground, and he's recognized that there's a bigger market in polarization. This is something that Fox News understood. Now, I think, one thing that doesn't keep me up at night is the media at a national level. I think the Washington Post, the New York Times, NPR, CNN are doing a great job. No one can say, we don't know what Trump is up to. I mean, there are issues there that we can talk about, but they are very robust. I think that after a lot of fear about what was going on at the national level, the Times will survive, the Post will survive, the Globe is doing okay. What does scare me is at the local level, what's happening. Susan mentioned that my wife Barbara is a journalist, a radio journalist, and she often tells the story that when she first came to Boston 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and was reporting out of the State House, there were 13 people covering the State House. You couldn't get a room, you couldn't find a desk in the press room. These days, I think there are 2 people up there full time. And we know, living in Massachusetts, what that means and what goes on, as we've seen recently with Stan Rosenberg and others, the kind of things that go on when the press isn't watching. And Boston actually has a very robust news ecosystem. I think we sometimes don't appreciate the fact that we've got the Boston Globe, which is a terrific newspaper. We've got 2 NPR stations. We've got very good local news. Go to even places like Philadelphia, Los Angeles, major cities that have just seen their newspapers and their news organizations decimated. And now you have Sinclair Broadcasting, which I'm sure some of you have read about, which is a very conservative, very ideologically driven organization that is buying up local news organizations. So one of the things I worry about is that even now at the local level, you will be able to curate your news and choose what you want. And I think that's bad for democracy, and it's something that I think we all need to worry about.
Maybe I could just jump onto that to say, are there any points of light that you see? Are there any sort of inspiring developments that you think are worth keeping in mind and worth tracking?
Yeah, no, I think the good news is the sort of the torrent of news that's out there. You don't have to look very far to get great investigative reporting from ProPublica and a number of other sites. Very good national reporting. The Washington Post, I think, now costs maybe $5 or $10 a month if you get Amazon Prime. I think that the big change is that you need to find those points of light and you need to connect them into something that's going to illuminate things. The old model of the news was, we sat in newsrooms, we wrote for the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the New York Times, NPR, CNN, and we put it out there and you received it. Now I think the burden is really on all of us as consumers of news to accumulate, whether it's through Twitter, through our Facebook feeds, through the things we list as bookmarks on our cell phones or on our laptops. It's more work. There's more out there. You can read the BBC, you can read The Economist. There are so many things out there, but you have to work at it. The other point of light, I think, is I'm actually very encouraged by millennials and by post-millennials. I'm teaching now, and I think one of the things that I'm struck by is how idealistic young people are. I think a lot of us, when Trump was elected, I think for a lot of the country, there's been this sense of kind of trying to understand what happened, what went wrong, or if you're a backer of Trump, a kind of anger and a desire to kind of go back to a certain time when America was different. I find young people, this is all new to them, and they're going to be living in this world for the next 50 years, and they're excited about it. And so I think, starting with the populations you're targeting and through colleges, there's a great opportunity to both educate students, not just in the facts, but how to get the facts, how to get different perspectives, how to learn to talk to other people. And I think that's a real opportunity for organizations like yours and for the media.
So that's a perfect segue. Let's go on to talk a bit about global reporting. You spent a number of years reporting from overseas, writing with great insight and humanity. These days, how do you make the case to your journalism students, to newsreaders, to the foundations of funders and faculty members you work with that global perspectives are vital? As US-based news organizations close down their foreign bureaus, where and how do you see the future for international reporting?
I think the paradox is, on the one hand, a lot of US news organizations have trimmed back their international reporting. I was the Berlin bureau chief of the Boston Globe, for example, and they closed their international bureaus because they're expensive. On the other hand, access to international news has never been easier, right? If you want to know what's going on in the Middle East, you can access Israeli publications, Palestinian publications, Saudi publications, bloggers. That's true everywhere around the world. I think what's really missing now is that question of how do you get Americans interested in these issues? And one of the things I think foreign correspondents always tried to do was to kind of make it relevant to the American audience. And that could be absurd sometimes, as a foreign correspondent in Berlin and in Beijing, I loved writing about baseball in Beijing or, things, they're just like us kind of stories in these countries. But that was a way to try to bring people in and make them aware of it. I think actually what I see happening is it's the changing demographics of the country that are going to be driving that thirst for knowledge. I taught a seminar at Northeastern this past semester called Covering Race and Class. 18 students, really smart, 2 of whom were from Russia, one of whom was a Muslim minority in Russia, one of whom was first generation, her parents were from Liberia. We had some African American students, some white guys, a student from Belgium. And I realized that that is what the country's going to look like. I mean, certainly it's what our cities are going to look like, certainly what Boston already looks like. And again, I sensed among these students, they didn't know much about each other. And so the students from Russia didn't understand why they couldn't use the N-word when they were parroting a rap song that they'd heard. And the African-American students pretty quickly educated them on that. But some of the American students couldn't understand what all the excitement was about headscarves and why are Europeans so upset about headscarves. So there was a good conversation about that. So I think the importance of global reporting and global perspectives is this is the world we live in. And whether you're going to become work for a company that's going to send you overseas, or you're going to be in an academic setting where you're dealing with people of different perspectives. I mean, the world is becoming more and more diverse. And I think having that awareness is really what drives it. It's not a nice thing to do. It's not a moral thing to do. It's an essential thing to do if you're going to succeed in this world.
We see that phenomenon in K-12 classrooms too. The world is in our classrooms, and so in many ways it's students who are driving their teachers and their administrators to engage with global issues. That was a great answer. I want to pursue that topic a little further because it's such a strong point of connection between the work you do and primary source. So part of the work that we do at K-12 teachers, as you know, John, involves disrupting stereotypes of people around the world that students absorb from many different places, but among them, the mainstream media. Do you share the view that media outlets oversimplify or propagate stereotypes, stereotype narratives about other countries, and that they offer insufficient context very often for us to understand the rest of the world in a more complex way? And if that's the case, how might we tackle this problem together?
Well, I think whenever people talk about the media, it's sort of like talking about the United States. I mean, media is very diverse. If you're talking about Fox News or Breitbart or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or NPR or Rachel Maddow, I mean, everyone, there's a lot of media out there. And I think people tend to pick and choose what they want to kind of make their point. Sure, we all stereotype, but in a way, stereotypes are sometimes just a shorthand to try to understand a complex issue. And I think what's important to teach students, to teach us as news consumers, is where to go when you want to go deep, okay? So there comes a time in all our lives, often when we're traveling, suddenly you're going to be in Turkey, or suddenly you're going to, be in Argentina, and I really suddenly want to know about Argentina and Turkey. And you can go to a place like The Economist, or various websites and get kind of on a 4-hour plane flight or an 8-hour plane flight a real sense of what's going on. And I think that's what's important. I think that, teaching students what questions to ask and where to look for reliable information, I think is what's important. We're all going to walk around with certain scratches on our minds that are just there, but what's important is, I went to the Middle East on a trip to Israel and Palestine. And Israel and Palestine, for those of you who have been there, the last person you speak to, you're persuaded by, right? Because everybody has a very compelling story to tell. By contrast, places like China you go to, and you really have to listen very carefully because people are telling you things, but a lot of it is in what they're not telling you or what they can't talk about. But I think the best skill we can have is to say, when I go back to my hotel room, when I go back after my meeting in a country, when I'm back on the plane, or when I'm trying to have a conversation with someone here about that country, where do I go to get some good information? Those sources are out there. People just have to know kind of the 4 steps they have to take on the internet to get there.
Next time you're traveling overseas, look in the primary source website. Really admire the courageous and groundbreaking stories that you wrote, John, in this arena. All of it in different ways, I would say, championing students. These days, what are the big stories in education that you think are not being covered or not being told well enough?
It's a great question. One of them is, I think 10 years from now we will look back and realize that the cost of higher education especially, and student debt, is a huge issue. And that in the same way the mortgage crisis and the catastrophe of 2008 really fundamentally affected the economics and the politics of this country, I think we're coming to a reckoning about that. I see it in students now who say, I can't go back for a master's degree, I'm too much in debt. I can't afford to buy a house, I'm too much in debt. I think for those of us looking at our children or our grandchildren or younger colleagues, this is a real issue. Bernie Sanders clearly tapped into that, and I think it's only going to grow. And I think there's going to be a lot of resentment against the boomers and others who kind of let this develop. And I think it's really saddling millennials and post-millennials with a huge burden. The other thing, and this is the thing I am very worried about and sad about, it's sort of in 2 parts. Education was always the way in which America narrowed economic gaps, racial gaps, where it brought people together. Right? All of us have the story of, people from immigrant backgrounds, from rich backgrounds. They all came together, starting in primary, secondary, high school, and then through college, and that was the great leveler. Now, obviously, as we see increasingly, education is separating people. Very often, the New York Times has done terrific reporting about this, showing that if you're a black boy growing up in a poor neighborhood, your chances of success, even if you go to an Ivy League college, are as good as a white working class boy. And so education is increasingly reinforcing divisions. Northeastern, every college is like this. Every college admissions office among the elite top 50 colleges have 100 high schools they pull other students from, and they go back to them over and over again. The other thing that I think is happening, in part because of that, is that schools and then college are the one place where people of different backgrounds can meet each other on kind of equal ground, right? You're all going to eat the crappy food in the cafeteria, you're all going to be talking about dating, you'll all be complaining about the unfair professor. Once you leave college, as we all know, people tend to live in segregated neighborhoods, their workplaces are often segregated, politics as we see is polarized. So if you're going to plant those seeds of understanding and compassion and curiosity in people, it's really got to be done in school and in universities. And I think that's not happening. I think there's a squandered opportunity that is scary, because as the country becomes more diverse, we have to ask ourselves, well, where are people going to come together and learn about each other? Because if they don't, then I think they're more liable and more susceptible to the kind of polarizing attacks and the politics of division that a lot of politicians want to push forward.
John, on a more personal question, so I'm interested in knowing your own personal regimen for keeping informed. Has your own pattern of news consumption changed over the years, and is there anything that you like these days that, in terms of a news source that's exciting that we should know about?
That's interesting. So I'm still actually, I think we're all creatures of when we grew up and when we sort of came to the news. So I still basically have transferred my usual reading habits to my cell phone. So I'll read the New York Times, I'll go to the New York Times homepage, I'll go to the Washington Post homepage, I'll listen to GBH in the morning, I'll occasionally watch things on TV. But I rely much more now on Twitter. I use Twitter, and this is something I recommend to people if you're trying to create a news feed. One of the things I have my students do, so this is interesting. So the first day of class, I teach the big introductory understanding the news course at Northeastern. And so my very first class, I say to the students, look, you got into Northeastern, you're here, I want to know the truth. Where do you get your news? Don't tell me you read, the New York Times cover to cover and subscribe to Der Spiegel and all the stuff you wrote in your application essay. I want to know where do you get your news? And you know what they said the past 2 semesters? Snapchat. Now, I was horrified at first, but then I realized what they were saying was they would get alerts basically on Snapchat and then click on the stories and then go to them. And increasingly, and I'm sure this is true for more and more of all of us, people curate their news feeds and get stuff through Facebook, what we in the news business call the side door. So what I think I try to do is to create lots of side doors. I basically go on Twitter and I have a list of people I follow. One of the things I have done, I really recommend this, it's kind of like, eating the right foods. I've tried to identify 4 or 5 people I really disagree with, and I force myself to follow them. On the argument that, if I want to know what, Paul Ryan and the Republicans in Congress are thinking, I follow the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Because even though I may want to throw my phone across the room sometimes, that's an important, thoughtful, challenging place to get news. And I think that's something, as I said, the responsibility I think now falls on us to sort of do that. Because it's not going to be force-fed to us. We've got to actively go out and do that. Through my students, I've discovered all sorts of podcasts and things run often by journalists of color, which are fascinating. I mean, I only saw Black Panther because my students made me see it. So I'd be vaguely, hip when I showed up in class one day. But through them, they recommended lots of interesting sites and people to follow. There's a lot of really good stuff out there. I also think the other thing, and I think this will become clearer as the news devouring public becomes younger, is Google has really changed our brains. And I think we all know that, which is that we have much shorter attention spans, we're much more susceptible to shorter videos, get to the point, graphics and things like that. And I think that's a change that I'm adapting to. But for example, we have a graduate student who just was a Pulitzer Prize finalist because she came up with all the graphics that went with the Boston Globe series on racism. And what was so interesting was I would have approached that series as we did many years ago through the narratives of people's stories of race and racism. The Globe decided to approach it very much through statistics and graphs and numbers and very vivid visuals. And I think it was very effective. So I think that that's something we all need to kind of be more open to. And certainly within newsrooms, there's a huge amount of energy behind that, which is that, and we know this, we're competing for people's time. People are really busy. And while you may have time to read the New Yorker, Sundays, and we should all do that, and that's great, things are getting shorter, and we've got to make sure our news diet is varied enough that we can still get all the news that we need, even in these different mediums.
Ready to hear what you would like to know about. So thank you, Deborah. We've got some questions. Okay. So John, thank you. Those were marvelous answers. And let me see how far we can get with these. So in a world where everyone wants free information, how do you fund and staff investigative journalism?
That's a great question. So I'll repeat an anecdote that Walter Robinson was the head of the Spotlight team, and if you've seen the movie Spotlight, he's Michael Keaton, or Michael Keaton is him. So Robbie is actually teaching at Northeastern, and he's done some terrific work with the students, he's done terrific work as a journalist, and he always tells this story, which is if you've seen the movie Spotlight, the opening scene involves Marty Baron coming to the newsroom and basically asking about a story he read in the Globe about a priest who was accused of abusing children. And that launches the movie and leads to the tremendous investigative reporting they did in exposing sex abuse in the Catholic Church. What the movie doesn't make clear is that that article was a column that a reporter wrote based on a court case in the Suffolk County Courthouse that the Globe reported on about this priest who had done this. The Globe doesn't have anybody covering the courts anymore. So things like that can be going on, but nobody would know. And so the thing about investigative reporting is it's expensive, it takes a lot of time, and you have to have people out there doing it. And all the surveys that have been done show that readers want investigative reporting, that it's the most important thing. I've been involved in it. I can tell you it's not only expensive, it's dangerous. I mean, I've been involved in things where, the publisher doesn't want things published and you have to fight that battle. You need lawyers to protect you. So we have to invest in it. And, as journalists keep on saying is, you don't walk into Starbucks and say, I'd like a free coffee. You don't walk into you don't go to Amazon and say, I'd like that book for free. You have to pay for things. And I think what people need to understand is that it's not just the kind of big investigative stories that people pay for, and places like ProPublica do a really good job at that. It's the everyday shoe-leather reporting that leads to those big stories, right? It's only because reporters are out there hearing things, reporting things, that they're able to do it. Now, there are models out there, nonprofits, ProPublica being the best known one, New England Center for Investigative Reporting, which is affiliated with GBH, is another. But I think if we care about accountability, if we want to know what's going on at the State House, if we want to know what's going on in Washington, if we want to know what's going on in our towns, you need robust newsrooms with reporters who will go out and say, something smells fishy there, I want to dig into it. And that's going to cost things. It's not that expensive. I think the Globe is good value for money. If you give, $20, $30 a month to NPR, that's good value for money. I think we have to be prepared to pay for it because the returns are enormous.
So here's a teacher-to-teacher question. You're a teacher as well. This audience member wrote, thank you very much for talking about truth in this era where people live in echo chambers. I work with teenagers coming to the US for school from other countries. Echo chamber is even more severe a problem for them. How can I start conversations with them about truth? How can I help them and local teenagers having in-depth conversation about social issues and, more important, truth from different perspectives? You have some
I see that a lot with Chinese students who come here. And I think part of what we have to understand is that for people coming from overseas, their cultural experience, and this is what primary source is all about, is very different. Their sense of history is very different. Their understanding of the role of the media is very different. I remember I was in Germany, in Berlin, when the Berlin Wall fell, and all of us as journalists went running over to East Germany to interview people. They were having their first free elections. So I had my notebook, I had my translator, I'm running around East Berlin, and nobody would talk to me. And I couldn't figure out why until my translator, who had grown up in East Germany, said, well, the only people who used to come around with notebooks, ask people their names, and write down what they said were the secret police. So I think that, what I've noticed with Chinese students, say, is that they will come to a place like Northeastern, but publicly they don't want to speak out very much because they don't know who to trust. I mean, the reality is for Chinese students, certainly, the Chinese government is all over universities keeping an eye on them. And so they're not going to necessarily stand up the way an American student might and speak freely and talk about what's wrong with the government or whatever, because that could get them in real trouble. I think, though, the questioner is onto something, which is if you get other students, other teenagers, to have those conversations. But also, again, I think Americans, we are kind of arrogant. We think we know everything. And I think having students and teenagers approach each other honestly, not with sort of wagging their finger, but trying to understand, what is it like? Our youngest son, was in China for a semester, last semester, at a Chinese university, where he could only speak Chinese, his roommates were Chinese, and it was really interesting because all they wanted to talk to him about was, why is everybody shooting each other in America? And it was sort of interesting, putting yourself in the other person's shoes makes you realize, well, wait a second, there are more complex things, and I think that's the start of an honest dialogue, as opposed to, you're in this country, let me tell you what you should think. Whereas I think teenagers going out, talking about teenager things, having them go see Black Panther together, that can then start conversations about social justice, which are maybe more interesting and open.
So, Jonathan, we had another question related to China, and I wonder if you want to take a gander at this one. Would you care to comment about media and freedom of information, or suppression of information in China at present, and how does it compare with the situation when you were there?
No, in a way, what's most interesting about China, China's never had a free press. It's never been part of it. What I think China is now at the second level, which frankly the Russians are at too, with their manipulation of the American system, which is that China's understanding how to use the media to both spy on people and to shape the conversation. So China used to be very clumsy. They would just cut off access, and people would have to sort of find out things around the kitchen table or quietly. They've become much more effective in terms of pushing a message. And when you talk to the Chinese, there's a grain of truth in everything they know about America or about their own society. But young people especially have a very distorted view of the world. Now, they might say the same thing about us. Europeans would probably say the same thing. But I think what's different now is that it's not just a matter of censorship, it's a matter of manipulation. And I think the big change that's happened, and I would argue you see it at places like Fox News and Sinclair, probably among some of the more liberal sites, but I think the conservatives have been better at it, is that they've weaponized news, right? They've realized that you can use news and information in a way that not only prevents the truth from getting out, but actually changes the way people see the world. And my sense of China now is that they're doing this at a very sophisticated level. The Russians clearly are too. I think Fox is doing it, and Sinclair, I think, is trying to do it. And that's a world in which I know among journalists, among colleagues of mine, we've never quite dealt with that world before. We've always believed, let 100 flowers bloom, lots of information is out there, people will make the right decision. I'm not sure how true that is when the playing field is no longer equal and there's this kind of asymmetric warfare that's going on. It's scary, and I think China has gotten quite good at it.
When the attempts were clumsy, it was much easier to recognize, like those strange, badly worded emails that you get that are patently false, and the bad grammar clues you in, but if somebody just starts editing those, it will be hard to recognize them. I agree, that's good insight. John, how about this one? Another audience member wanted to know, what will be the major challenges the media faces in covering the midterm races and elections?
So I think the media basically had a nervous breakdown after 2016. Not because of who won, but that we all missed it. And you could sense that in newsrooms. What happened? And, I think it's funny. I think for the first time in memory, reporters made a mistake because they didn't talk to enough taxi drivers and go to enough bars, so we're always accused of doing. And I think that what you saw was this feeling that because the media was focused on the coast, had gotten kind of bewitched by data, and I'm sure all of you were watching, those kind of barometers on the front page of the New York Times and seeing, Hillary has a 38 or 98 or 57% chance of winning, that obviously the media and a lot of people missed what the election was about. In response to that, what you've seen is kind of, I call it kind of Trump tourism going on, where basically every news organization, the Globe, the Post, the Times, NPR, they're all sending people out to Indiana and South Dakota and West Virginia to sort of find the elusive Trump voter. And what do they think? It prompted a terrific piece that Indiana Magazine did a great piece where they had a reporter who wrote a piece. He said, I wanted to find the Hillary voter. So I went to where I believe they were hiding out in Brooklyn at the food co-op where I could see them drinking their kombucha. It was, but behind it was actually a very good piece where this reporter went and interviewed all these Hillary voters in Brooklyn. But one of the things that the piece ended up saying was, it wasn't just that they don't like Trump, they don't like us. And I thought there was a real truth in that, which was the media's disengagement from a lot of the country. Whatever you agree or disagree politically, media has an obligation to let, we missed a lot of the anger that was out there, a lot of the feelings of the way the country was changing demographically, economically. So the midterms now are a test for the media to try to get it right. I think they'll do better. I think they'll be cautious. I think you'll see, hopefully fewer predictions. But I think the media is chastised by what happened. And I think there's going to be more of an effort to try to get more voices out there. But again, like stereotypes, predictions are something everyone loves to do. And there are going to be some surprises, and it's, I wish we could get out of the prediction business, but it's just too tempting.
Conversations now than in decades past. Why, and what are the consequences?
Yeah, no, this is a really important issue, and I'll illustrate it kind of where I started talking about the Pentagon Papers. So for those of you who have seen the movie The Post or know about the Pentagon Papers, in a way, the Pentagon Papers is a tremendous example of the business side of news doing the right thing. It was the New York Times being courageous enough, the publisher, to print the Pentagon Papers even though they knew that Nixon was going to try to close them down. Catherine Graham does the same thing, the Boston Globe does the same thing. But if you look now, the situation is different. The Washington Post is now owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon. A good guy, from all we can tell, is investing a lot. On the other hand, Trump is clearly, talking about increasing Amazon's taxes, costing them hundreds of millions of dollars. If there's a challenge to the press, which I think there will be, Trump has already been talking to James Comey before he fired him about making an example of the press, trying to kind of put some reporters in jail. So something will happen. How will the Post respond? How will John Henry, who's now the owner of the Boston Globe and owns the Red Sox, and how will he respond? The Sulzbergers still own the New York Times, but it's a new generation. They're under tremendous financial pressure. I think I can guess how Rupert Murdoch will respond. I work for Mike Bloomberg. I don't know how he would respond. So the corporate ownership, I think, becomes important, not just in terms of the news that we see, but if the government decides to come after us. Someone said to me the other day, Richard Nixon did to the press what Trump would like to do. Now, if Trump decides to follow through, this question of corporate ownership is going to become really an important one. And we don't really know how it's going to play out, much less how it would then play out in the courts and so forth. So it's something to be worried about.
Are we okay for... No. Are you okay? So this be the last one. Okay. All right. In your opinion, John, should public schools, K-12, teach about values and character? If so, how? If not, why not?
Let me ask you a question. How would you define values and character? In what way?
I'm not sure what the speaker was referring to, but
And I do want to say, I mean, I think what primary source does is so important because, again, I guess I define values and character not as this is the way to do it or this is the politically correct way to do something. It's being open, curious, and informed about something, right? You may go online and take that China course you described and say, China did go through 100 years of humiliation. Or you may say, no, that's overstating it. But at least you have some information to back it up. So I think if we're talking about character and values as tolerance, curiosity, respect for people, I think that's important. I mean, I did have this experience of teaching a class on covering race in class to college students, which I was worried could become a minefield, given all we know of the kind of issues on college campuses these days. And at one point we started to get into it about could you have controversial speakers on campus, and some of the students of color were, really agitated about that, and they said, I don't want to feel unsafe. I don't want to feel unsafe. And one of the students said, well, in this class, I've often felt uncomfortable, but I've never felt unsafe. Which I thought was actually a pretty good guideline, and I think maybe, apply to schools as well. Which is that I think as teachers, or as administrators, it's our job to challenge students and to make them feel uncomfortable and to make them rethink those things. That's value, that's character. What they do with that information, we may have no control over, but at least if they've got the foundations of listening and understanding and kind of understanding the impact of what they say, I'm fine teaching that, and I think it's essential.
This just in, can you riff for 60 seconds on The Wire?
Yeah, The Wire's great. I mean, it's hard to follow, I think, because a lot of the dialogue, goes very fast. But and again, I think The Wire is important because I think part of what's happened is that there's so much focus now on Trump and on what's going on in Washington. I was in a panel of White House correspondents 2 weeks ago, and they were all talking about, the New York Times woman was saying that she had a story about the EPA and all that's going on at the EPA at the local level that's really causing long-term damage. And she can't get it in the paper because the Scott Pruitt, will he or won't he, is he in or is he out, is just dominating things. The Wire captures a part of America that we're not paying attention to much anymore. Inner cities, poor African Americans, poor Latinos. And I worry that this fascination and obsession with what's going on in Washington will distract us. Watching The Wire is a reminder that there are issues there, social problems, they show up in the schools all the time, that are going to be there long after Washington changes. And in a way, if we don't pay attention to it, it's going to do more long-lasting damage to our country. So I think being aware of that and the issues it raises is important as part of my broader call for educating ourselves about what's going on, because you're not going to necessarily get it from your Facebook feed.
Jonathan, thank you for your wonderful, in-depth, insightful.
Well, Jonathan and Susan, what an enlightening and interesting conversation. I so appreciate you coming and sharing with us tonight. It is so helpful for us to understand how best to navigate the seemingly never-ending media blast ongoing today. It's also very relevant because we deal with this with teachers, and this is a small example of what we actually do in the classroom. We bring scholars like Professor Kaufman to our teachers, and then we help them translate that into how they can use it in a K-12 setting. Something that you might argue, I'm sure you found very interesting tonight. I think teachers here find it very interesting tonight. Before we get to dessert, there's two things we need to do. The first, there are teachers in the room, and it's Teacher Appreciation Week. And so we want to give some appreciation to the teachers. If you can raise your hands, the teachers can raise your hands so we can see them. Every day at Primary Source is Teacher Appreciation Day, but today we love honoring you and we love working with you.